The morning arrived the way it always did on Bleecker Street, gray and indifferent, carrying the scent of last night's rain and yesterday's regrets. Walter Haynes did not notice the cold the way younger men might. At 71, the cold had become an old companion, familiar and unavoidable, like the ache that lived permanently in his left knee or the way his fingers curled slightly inward now, stiff at the knuckles, as though his hands were slowly remembering something his mind was trying to forget. He sat on the stone steps of the old Meridian Hotel, his coat, a charcoal wool overcoat, once beautiful, now threadbare at both elbows, pulled tight across his chest. Beside him rested a canvas bag, the kind sold at grocery stores for $1, containing everything he had decided still mattered. A folded photograph, a small bar of soap wrapped in a paper towel, a worn paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea, and $3.40 in loose change. He was not, by the world's casual measurement, a man who looked like he had ever mattered. To the morning commuters who passed him on their way toward warmth and purpose, Walter was simply part of the scenery, like the cracked planter box near the hotel's entrance, or the faded awning that snapped lazily in the November wind. A few glanced at him the way people glance at things that make them briefly uncomfortable. Most did not glance at all. Walter had grown accustomed to invisibility. It had crept over him gradually, the way evening light fades not all at once, but so steadily that by the time you noticed, the darkness had already settled in. It had been 14 months since the boarding house on Clement Street had asked him to leave. 14 months of shelter beds and park benches, and when the shelters were full and the benches too cold, the long, slow walk through the night simply to keep warm. He had never spoken of it to anyone. There was no one left, really, to speak to. Elinor had been gone 6 years now. He thought of her, as he always did in the mornings, in the quiet before the city became too loud. He thought of the way she used to stand in the doorway of their kitchen in San Francisco, her hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, a cup of tea held in both hands. She would look at him, not at anything he was doing, just at him, with an expression he had never been able to name, something between gratitude and wonder, as though she could not quite believe he was real. "Play something, Walt," she used to say. "Play something and make the morning feel less ordinary." He had always played. In those days he had always played. Walter rose slowly from the steps, steadying himself with one hand against the cold stone, and began his daily walk, not because he had anywhere to be, but because movement kept the grief from settling too heavily in one place. It was 3 blocks down, on the corner of Meridian and 4th, that he first saw it. The Aldrich building had been empty for 2 years. A grand old structure from the 1920s, it had once housed a concert hall on its ground floor, the kind of intimate, chandelier-lit space where serious music was played for serious listeners. Now its windows were dark, its entrance sealed behind plywood boards. The city had plans for it, or so the faded development notice taped to the board suggested. Luxury apartments, a rooftop terrace, a coffee brand as anchor tenant. But someone, in the chaos of the building's gradual surrender, had left the front door unlocked. Walter noticed, because one of the plywood boards had come partially loose, swinging slightly open, revealing a strip of darkness within. He should have walked past. He told himself to walk past. Instead, he stopped. He stood there on the pavement, his canvas bag at his side, his breath making small, quiet clouds in the cold air. From somewhere inside, from the dark interior of that forgotten building, there came the faintest sound. Not music. Not yet. Only the suggestion of it, the low, resonant hum of a large room, the particular kind of silence that belongs to spaces built for sound. Walter Haynes had not touched a piano in 6 years. Not since the morning after Elinor's funeral, when he had sat down at their upright Steinway in the front room of their San Francisco home and played for 4 hours without stopping, playing everything he had ever known and some things he had not known he still remembered, playing until his hands shook and his face was wet, and the neighbors had knocked gently on the door to ask if everything was all right. He had sold the piano 3 weeks later when the medical bills arrived and the house had to go. He had not played since. Now, standing before this dark and abandoned doorway, his arthritic hands hanging at his sides, Walter felt something stir in his chest, something old and aching and terrifyingly alive. Like a door opening in a room he had bricked shut. He looked up and down the empty street. Then, quietly, with the measured dignity of a man who had learned long ago not to let the world see what moved him, Walter Haynes stepped through the gap in the boards and disappeared into the darkness. What he found inside would change everything. Not for him, for everyone else. The interior of the Aldrich building smelled of dust and damp plaster, and something older beneath that, something that took Walter a moment to identify, and then did, with a quiet ache in his chest. It smelled of rosin, of polished wood, of the particular mineral warmth that concert halls accumulate over decades of breath and music and applause. The smell of a place that had once been filled with something beautiful and had not yet forgotten it. Walter stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows. Pale strips of gray morning fell across the floor in long diagonals, illuminating motes of dust that drifted with the slow, unhurried patience of snow. The hall was not large, perhaps 200 seats, arranged in curved rows that descended gently toward a low stage. Most of the seats had been removed, their absence marked by rows of small circular holes in the wooden floor where the bolts had been. A few remained near the back, upholstered in what had once been deep burgundy velvet, now faded to a color somewhere between rust and memory. And there on the stage sat the piano, a Börsendorfer Imperial, 97 keys. Black lacquer, though the finish had dulled and in places lifted at the edges, and one of the hinges on the fallboard had come loose so that the lid sat slightly askew. It had been left behind, too large, perhaps, or too expensive to move, or simply overlooked in the hurried evacuation of a building that no one had loved enough to save properly. Walter descended the gentle slope of the aisle slowly, one hand trailing along the backs of the remaining seats. His knee complained with each step, but he paid it no particular attention. His eyes were fixed on the piano, the way a man's eyes fix on the face of someone he once loved, and has not seen in a very long time. He had just reached the foot of the stage when the doors at the back of the hall swung open. The light that flooded in was sharp and sudden, and Walter turned, blinking. There were 4 of them. Young, late 20s, perhaps early 30s, wearing the particular uniform of people who worked in development and acquisition. Good coats, expensive shoes, lanyards with laminated badges, tablets in hand. They were talking amongst themselves with the easy, clipped confidence of people who had never been made to wait for anything important. Leading them was a man who introduced himself to no one in particular as Brennan Cole. His name was on the lanyard, and he repeated it twice in the first minute, as men of his type often do. He was perhaps 32, with the kind of square jaw and clean haircut that photographed well, and he moved through the space with the brisk, proprietary energy of someone measuring what something is worth before deciding what to do with it. He noticed Walter almost immediately. He stopped walking. The others stopped behind him. Brennan Cole looked at Walter, at the threadbare coat, the canvas bag, the slow, careful way the old man had turned to face them, and his expression moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, irritation, and then something that settled into a particular kind of contempt that required no effort to sustain, because it had been practiced so long it had become instinct. "Hey," he said. His voice carried easily in the empty hall. "This is a restricted property. You can't be in here." Walter said nothing. He simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the stage, and looked at the young man with the calm, level gaze of someone who has survived enough to be unimpressed by volume. Brennan Cole crossed his arms. Behind him, one of his colleagues, a young woman with a tablet, was already typing something, perhaps a note, perhaps a text. her eyes flicking between her screen and the old man with the faint curiosity people reserve for things that are mildly amusing. "I'm going to need you to leave," Brennan said again, more slowly this time, in the deliberate way people speak to those they have already decided cannot understand them properly. "This building is under private acquisition review. You shouldn't be here." He paused and then added loudly enough that his colleagues could hear, with a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "The shelter on Morrison Street is 3 blocks east. They might be able to help you." One of the others gave a short laugh. Not a cruel laugh exactly, more the reflex of someone who wanted to be on the right side of the room. Walter looked at Brennan Cole for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hands. His fingers, those curved, arthritic fingers, were resting against the old wood of the stage. He could feel, even through the thin skin of his palm, the faint vibration of the floor, the deep structural hum of a building that had been built to hold music, and still, in some molecular way, remembered that purpose. He did not respond to the young man, not because he could not because he was afraid or humiliated into silence. Walter Haynes had lived long enough to know that some words were not worth the breath required to answer them. He picked up his canvas bag from the floor. He straightened his coat with the unhurried dignity of a man dressing for something important. And then, instead of moving toward the exit as Brennan Cole clearly expected him to, Walter turned and with deliberate slowness lifted himself up onto the stage. The room went quiet. Brennan Cole uncrossed his arms. "Excuse me, what are you? I just told you." Walter did not look at him. He walked slowly, yes, with that troublesome knee, and with the careful gait of a man who has learned to carry himself with precision, because the body no longer offers certainty, across the stage toward the Bersendorfer. He set his canvas bag down beside the piano bench. He stood before the instrument for a moment, his back to the room, his head slightly bowed. "Sir." Brennan Cole's voice had sharpened now, edged with the particular frustration of a man whose authority has been acknowledged and then quietly ignored. "I am asking you to leave this building. If you do not, I will call the police." Walter reached out and with 2 fingers gently lifted the askew fallboard, the lid covering the keys, and let it rest against the music desk. He looked down at the keys, 88 of them in most pianos, 97 in a Bersendorfer Imperial. The extra 9 at the bass end were covered in black rather than white, a signature of the instrument, those deep, resonant additional notes that gave the Bersendorfer a gravity that other concert grands could approach but never quite match. Walter's right hand moved slowly, as though pulled by something beyond his own decision, and one finger, the index finger of his right hand, the knuckle swollen, the skin loose and spotted with age, came to rest on a single key. Middle C. He pressed it. The note rang out into the empty hall, full and resonant and startlingly alive, and did not stop quickly as a neglected piano's note might. It sustained. It opened. It filled the room from floor to boarded window like something that had been waiting, patient and undiminished, for exactly this. Brennan Cole said nothing. No one said anything. Walter sat down on the bench. And in the silence that followed, the long, suspended moment before anything else happened, the young woman with the tablet slowly lowered it to her side, her fingers going still. She had heard something in that single note. She did not know what it was yet, but she had heard it. The bench creaked softly beneath Walter's weight as he settled onto it, a small, domestic sound that seemed almost tender in that grand, hollow space. He adjusted himself slowly, the way he always had, shifting slightly to the left, aligning his spine with a posture so natural and precise that it belonged to muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Decades of sitting this way had written it into his body permanently, the way certain prayers, said often enough, write themselves into the breath. He placed both hands in his lap for a moment and simply looked at the keys. Up close, the Bersendorfer showed its years with a kind of weathered honesty that Walter found, if anything, comforting. Several of the white keys had yellowed to the color of old ivory. One had a hairline crack running along its length, thin as a spider's thread. The felt dampers, visible through the open lid above, were moth-eaten at their edges. The piano had been tuned last, he could not know when, but he suspected some years ago, possibly the final season before the hall closed, and since then the strings had drifted in the way strings do when no one is listening, settling into their own private approximation of pitch. It would not sound perfect. Walter knew this before he played a single note. He had stopped requiring perfection from things a long time ago. Behind him, Brennan Cole had not left. Walter was aware of this the way one is aware of weather, not by looking directly at it, but by the quality of the air, the particular texture of the silence at his back. The young man was waiting, Walter supposed, for compliance, for the shuffle of an old man rising from a bench and making his way meekly toward the exit, for the situation to resolve itself in the way situations involving people like Walter were supposed to resolve themselves. Walter had no intention of resolving it that way, but he did not play yet. Instead, he did something he had not done in 6 years. He lifted the fallboard fully, the long lid over the strings, and propped it open with the wooden prop rod, exposing the instrument's interior. In the dim, angled light from the boarded windows, the strings caught what illumination there was and held it, 220 of them running in their precise, angled rows. And for a moment the inside of the piano looked like something astronomical, like a photograph of a galaxy, or the inside of a clock built to measure something grander than time. Walter looked at it for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was keeping something carefully contained. Eleanor had loved this view. She had not been a musician, had never played anything herself, but whenever Walter sat at the Steinway at home and lifted the lid, she would come and stand beside him and look in at the strings with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. "It's like a harp lying down," she had said once, "like music sleeping." He had laughed at that. He remembered the laugh. He reached up and pressed his fingertips very lightly against 3 strings in the middle register. He did not press hard enough to produce sound, only enough to feel the tension in them, the coiled potential, the physics of something wound tight and waiting. He checked 2 more. He pressed a chord silently, letting the strings vibrate against his skin without sounding. The young woman with the tablet, her name was Priya, though Walter did not know this, had drifted, without quite realizing she was doing it, 3 steps closer to the stage. She was not typing anymore. She was watching his hands. There was something about them that she couldn't quite name. She had expected, upon first seeing the old man in the threadbare coat, the hands that went with that image, rough, perhaps, or shaking, or simply the undistinguished hands of someone for whom life had become mostly a matter of endurance. But these hands were different. Even curved as they were, even marked by arthritis and age, they moved across the strings with a certainty that was not casual. They touched the instrument the way someone touches a thing they know intimately, from the inside out, not exploring but remembering. She found herself thinking, without fully meaning to, he has done this before. He has done this 10,000 times. Brennan Cole had moved to stand beside her. His irritation had not softened exactly, but it had changed quality, had become something more like impatience mixed with an uncertainty he would not have admitted to. He watched the old man on the bench and said, in a lower voice this time, as though the room had somehow earned a reduced volume, "What is he doing?" Priya did not answer. Walter had placed both hands on his thighs, palms down, and closed his eyes. He was not, at that moment, in the Aldrich building on the corner of Meridian and 4th. He was somewhere else entirely. He was in a room he had not visited in 6 years. A room that existed only in the architecture of memory, with a particular quality of afternoon light, and the smell of lemon oil on wood, and Eleanor in the doorway with her tea, and the whole of his life arranged around him the way a piece of music arranges itself, not randomly, but with intention, each part serving something larger than itself. He thought of the conservatory in Boston, where he had studied for 4 years under a professor named Aldous Marsh, a fierce and brilliant man who spoke very little but listened with the whole of his body. He thought of the audition at 24 for the San Francisco Symphony. The one he had passed, and then quietly withdrawn from 6 months later because Eleanor was pregnant with their son David. And the touring schedule would have meant months away. And he had looked at his young wife and his forming family and made a choice so quickly and so completely that he had never, in the years that followed, permitted himself to examine it too closely. He had taught instead 31 years of private lessons in the front room of their home on Linden Street, children mostly, a few adults. He had been a good teacher, patient, exacting, deeply kind. His students had gone on to conservatories, to orchestras, to careers he had once imagined for himself. He had not minded. He had told himself this so many times that it had become simply true, the way things do. David had died at 38, a Tuesday in March, 7 years before Eleanor. An aneurysm, the kind that gives no warning, that does not negotiate. There had been a phone call, and then there had been a world reorganized entirely around an absence so large that Walter had spent the first year simply trying to find the edges of it. He had played through that grief, as he had always played through everything. The piano had been the place where language failed and something else, something older and more honest, took over. And then Eleanor had gone and he had played that grief too, 4 hours without stopping, and then he had closed the piano and not opened it again. Until now. Walter opened his eyes. He looked down at the keys, yellowed, cracked, imperfect, and something moved across his face. Not sadness exactly, not happiness. Something that contained both and exceeded them. Something that had no name in common language, but that anyone who has ever loved something deeply and set it aside for a long time would recognize immediately. He raised his hands from his thighs. They were trembling slightly, not from weakness or from fear, but from the particular electricity of a thing long withheld that is about to be released. At the back of the hall, an old man had appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 80, wearing a building maintenance uniform, holding a ring of keys loosely in one hand. He had come, presumably, to check on the property, a weekly duty perhaps, or a monthly one. He had stopped in the doorway when he saw the figure on the stage, and he had not moved since. His name was Arthur Fleming, and he was the last remaining employee of the Aldrich building, tasked with its care until the sale went through. He had worked in this building for 34 years. He had heard music played on that stage, real music, important music, more times than he could count. He looked at the old man on the bench. He looked at the position of his hands, now raised above the keys. He looked at the straightness of his spine, and the angle of his wrists, and the way his head had tilted almost imperceptibly to one side, the way a man tilts his head when he is listening to something only he can hear. Arthur Fleming had seen enough musicians in his 34 years to know what he was looking at. His hand tightened slowly around the ring of keys. And Walter Haynes, 71 years old, homeless, invisible, unremarkable to every eye in that room except one, drew a single slow breath, the way a diver draws breath before descending, and began to play. The first notes were not loud. This surprised everyone in the room, though they could not have said precisely what they had expected. Something tentative, perhaps. Something rusty and uncertain. The halting, apologetic sounds of a man reaching for a thing he had lost and finding only the ghost of it. That would have made sense. That would have been comfortable and containable and easy to categorize. What came instead was quiet, yes, but not tentative, not halting, not apologetic. What came was deliberate. Walter began with a single melodic line in the right hand, unhurried, each note placed with the precision of a man who understands that silence between notes is not emptiness but structure, that music breathes in the spaces as much as in the sound. The melody was sound. The melody was simple at first, heartbreakingly simple, the kind of simplicity that is not the absence of complexity but its perfection, the kind that takes a lifetime to achieve. It was Schubert. The first movement of the piano sonata in B-flat major, the last sonata Schubert ever wrote, composed in the final weeks of his life. A piece that carries within it the full weight of a man who knows he is running out of time and chooses, in that knowledge, not to hurry. Priya recognized it 3 bars in. She had studied piano as a child, given it up at 14 for reasons she now, at 29, sometimes regretted in the quiet hours. She knew this piece, had attempted it once badly, at 16 under the instruction of a patient teacher who had never quite given up on her. She knew what it demanded. She knew what it was supposed to sound like in the hands of someone who truly understood it. She had never heard it sound like this. The left hand entered, and here the room changed. There is a moment in the Schubert B-flat sonata, near the opening, where the bass register introduces a trill, low, dark, almost subterranean, that has puzzled and moved musicians for nearly 2 centuries. It appears without warning, beneath the gentle melody, like something surfacing from deep water. Scholars have written about it. Pianists have debated it. Some have called it the sound of death hovering at the edge of beauty. Some have called it simply the most honest moment in all of piano literature, the acknowledgement that even in the most luminous of melodies, something immense and shadowed waits underneath. Walter played that trill now. And on the Börsendorfer, with its extended bass register, those 9 additional keys, that extra depth of resonance that no other concert grand possesses, the trill did not merely sound. It reverberated. It moved through the wooden floor of the stage and into the floor of the hall and up through the walls and into the air. And every person standing in that building felt it not only in their ears but in their sternum, in the soles of their feet, in some wordless, pre-linguistic part of themselves that predated language and would outlast it. Brennan Cole's mouth had opened slightly. He was not aware of this. He was not in that moment particularly aware of anything except the sound. A sound that was doing something to the air of the room that he did not have the vocabulary to describe and would not have admitted to in any professional context, but which was, in the simple biological fact of his response to it, making his eyes sting. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the floor. He looked back at the stage. Walter's hands moved across the keys with a fluency that was almost impossible to reconcile with what those hands looked like. The swollen knuckles, the curved fingers, the skin of a man in his 8th decade who had spent 14 months sleeping in shelters and on benches and walking through winter nights to keep warm. They should not have been capable of this. The medicine of the matter, the simple physics of arthritis and age and years of neglect, said they should not have been capable of this. But hands that have done something for 50 years do not entirely forget. The neural pathways carved by 10,000 hours of practice do not simply close over. They go quiet, perhaps. They wait. And when called upon again, they answer, not perfectly, not as they once did, but with a truth that transcends technical precision, because what remains when technique fades is something purer. Understanding, feeling the deep cellular knowledge of what the music means. Walter played with his eyes closed. His posture on the bench was extraordinary. Completely still from the waist up, no unnecessary movement, no performance of effort, only the arms, the hands, the fingers, doing exactly and only what was needed. This, too, was a mark of serious training. Amateurs move. They sway, they grimace, they perform their feeling for the room. Those who have truly mastered an instrument go still. They disappear into the music rather than placing themselves in front of it. Walter had disappeared. What remained on that stage was not a homeless man in a worn coat. What remained was something older and larger. A musician of the first order, playing one of the most profound pieces in the entire piano repertoire, in an abandoned hall on a gray November morning, with no audience, no occasion, and nothing to prove to anyone. Arthur Fleming, at the back of the hall, had set his ring of keys down on one of the remaining velvet seats. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his head slightly bowed, in the posture of a man in a place of worship. His eyes were wet. He did not bother to conceal this. At 80, Arthur had arrived at the place where concealing feeling seemed like a waste of the time remaining. He had heard Ashkenazi play in this hall in 1987. He had heard Parahia in 1993. He had heard a dozen others whose names were in the history books of serious music. He had stood in the back of this hall on all those nights and felt, each time, the particular privilege of being near greatness. He felt it now. The second theme entered, and here the Schubert opened like a landscape, like the view from a high place on a clear day, wide and aching and almost unbearably lovely. Walter's right hand sang the melody with a tenderness so unguarded that it no longer seemed like playing. It seemed like speaking, like confession. Priya had begun to cry. She had not made a decision to cry. Tears had simply arrived, the way they do when something bypasses every defense and touches the thing underneath directly. She was not embarrassed by them. She could not have been, because she had temporarily forgotten about everything except the sound and the man making it and the way the dusty November light fell across his white hair and his still, bent hands and his closed eyes. She thought without knowing why, he is playing this for someone who isn't here. She was right. Walter was playing for a leaner. He was playing for David. He was playing for the 24-year-old version of himself, who had sat in an audition room at the San Francisco Symphony and played brilliantly and been accepted, and then walked away. Not bitterly, not regretfully, but with the full, clear-eyed choice of a man who knew what he valued most. He was playing for all of it, for the life chosen and the life set aside, for the 31 years of teaching children in the front room on Linden Street, for the boarding house on Clement Street and the shelter beds and the cold benches and the 14 months of invisibility, for the photograph in his canvas bag, a leaner at 32, standing in front of the ocean, laughing at something off camera, her hair loose in the wind. For all of it. The music swelled not dramatically, not with the showy crescendo of a performer seeking applause, but with the slow, inevitable swell of something true. And in the upper register, Walter's right hand found a passage of such piercing sweetness that Brennan Cole, standing 10 feet from the stage with his arms no longer crossed, made a sound. It was small, barely audible, the kind of sound a person makes when something reaches them in a place they had forgotten was reachable. He turned away. He faced the wall. His shoulders moved once and then were still. His colleague, the one who had laughed earlier, was sitting on the floor. He had not planned to sit on the floor. His legs had simply made a decision his mind had not authorized, and now he sat with his knees up and his elbows on his knees, and his face tilted upward toward the ceiling as though looking for something there. The music continued, and the hall, this gutted, abandoned, condemned hall that the city had decided was worth more as luxury apartments than as a place where music lived, filled from floor to cracked ceiling, filled completely, the way a vessel fills when something is poured into it that is exactly the right shape. It was Priya who noticed, eventually, that other people had appeared in the doorway. A woman with a stroller, who had heard something through the gap in the boards as she passed on the pavement and had stopped. A young man in a delivery uniform, helmet still on, standing completely still. An older woman, perhaps 70 herself, in a good coat, carrying a shopping bag, who had both hands pressed flat against her sternum as though trying to hold something in. None of them knew who Walter Haynes was. None of them knew his name, or his history, or the choices he had made, or the things he had lost. They knew only what they were hearing. And what they were hearing was the truth of a life. The whole of it, the sacrifice and the love and the grief and the endurance, rendered in sound, on a broken piano, in an empty hall, by a man the world had decided it no longer needed to see. Walter played on, and the room, full now, impossibly full of sound and light and feeling, held its breath. He played for 31 minutes. No one counted. No one checked a phone or glanced at a watch or shifted toward the exit. Time had suspended itself in the way it only does in the presence of something that cannot be hurried. A birth, a death, a piece of music played with the whole of a human life behind it. The Schubert moved through its first movement with the patient, luminous gravity it had always possessed, and Walter followed it, or perhaps led it, or perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. Through every turn and return, every moment of shadow and opening, every place where the melody dipped toward darkness, and then, with a gentleness that was almost unbearable, found its way back toward light. He did not play perfectly. There were moments, 2, perhaps 3, where the arthritis asserted itself, where a passage that his mind knew precisely arrived slightly blurred at the fingers, where a chord that should have landed with crystalline clarity arrived instead with a softness, a smearing at the edges, that was not in Schubert's manuscript. In a concert hall with critics present, these moments would have been noted, discussed, measured against a standard. Here they were simply human, and somehow, inexplicably and yet completely, they made the music more true, not less. The imperfections were not failures. They were evidence. Evidence that this was not a performance constructed for applause, but something rawer and more necessary. A man speaking in the only language in which he had ever been entirely himself. The woman with the stroller had eased herself into one of the remaining burgundy seats near the back, the baby asleep against her chest, her free hand covering her mouth. She was 26 years old and had never heard a Schubert piano sonata in her life. She did not know the composer's name or the name of the piece or anything about the history of the instrument being played. She knew only that something was happening in this room that she did not have words for, and that she was not ready to leave it. The older woman in the good coat, her name was Margaret. She was 73. She had been a piano teacher herself for 40 years in a suburb of London before retiring to New York to be near her daughter, stood in the doorway with her shopping bag at her feet, and her eyes closed and tears moving freely down her face. She recognized the Schubert. She recognized the sonata. She had taught its simpler passages to students for decades and heard its full performance perhaps a dozen times in concert halls. She had never heard it played like this. She understood, with the knowledge of someone who had spent a lifetime in proximity to music and musicians, exactly what she was listening to. She understood the level of training it represented, the years of discipline, the sacrifice of the kind of ego that lesser musicians cannot relinquish. She understood that the man on that stage, whoever he was, in whatever coat, with whatever story behind his being in this building on this morning, was not an amateur who had once played nicely. He was or had been an artist of the highest order. The thought arrived with a weight that nearly buckled her, and no one knew. No one in the street outside knew. The city did not know. The shelters where he had slept did not know. The people who had passed him on the steps of this building and looked away did not know. The world had walked past this man for 14 months, had looked at the coat, the bag, the bench, and had decided, in the careless shorthand by which the world makes its decisions, that there was nothing here worth stopping for. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth hard to keep herself quiet. It did not entirely work. The delivery man, 22, still wearing his helmet, a boy really, with no particular relationship to classical music or piano sonatas or the cultural weight of any of this, was standing with his arms hanging at his sides and his chin trembling. He could not have explained why. He would not have been able to, if asked, articulate a single thing about what he was hearing in musical terms. He only knew that it was doing something to him that nothing had done in a long time, cutting through the numbness of a long shift and a difficult month and a life that felt, at 22, already somehow smaller than he had been promised it would be, and reaching something underneath that was still tender, still alive, still capable of being moved. He thought without quite knowing where the thought came from. Someone has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He was not wrong. On the stage, Walter played. His face in the final passages of the movement had changed. The careful containment he had maintained, the composed, private expression of a man who has trained himself not to let the world see what moves him, had quietly dissolved. Not into collapse, not into visible weeping, but into something more complete and more honest, an openness, a transparency. as though the music and the playing of it had removed the last careful distance between the man and what he felt, and what remained was simply Walter Haynes, 71 years old, in full. He thought of Alina, not the Alina of the hospital, or the Alina of the last years, or even the Alina of middle age. He thought of the Alina of their first apartment in the Sunset District, 26 years old, laughing, always laughing at something or nothing, her laughter the most generous sound he had ever heard. He thought of the way she had sat beside him on the piano bench once, early in their marriage, and rested her head on his shoulder while he played, and fallen asleep there, and he had continued playing for an hour rather than wake her, and had been happier in that hour than he had known it was possible for a person to be. He thought of David at 8 years old, lying on the floor beneath the piano while Walter practiced, claiming that the vibrations in the wood were the best feeling in the world, better than anything. Walter had laughed at that. He remembered the laugh. He thought of the audition at 24 and the walk away from it and the absolute certainty of that walk. He did not regret it. He wanted to be clear about this, even here, even now, even in the full feeling of everything. He did not regret it. He had chosen love over ambition, presence over recognition, the life in the room over the life on the stage. And love had given him everything it had promised, and more, and then it had been taken, as all things are taken, and he had been left with this. With the music, the only part of himself that could not be sold or lost or evicted or made invisible. The final bars arrived. Schubert's ending to this movement is not a conclusion so much as a suspension. The music does not resolve triumphantly or collapse in grief, but simply opens gently into a kind of luminous uncertainty, a major key that does not feel like victory but like acceptance. Like a man standing at the edge of something vast and choosing, in full knowledge, to be at peace with the vastness. Walter played those final bars with a stillness in his hands that was the stillness of complete understanding. The last chord sounded. He held the sustain, letting it bloom and fill and gradually, so gradually, begin to fade. And then he lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. And the Aldrich building was silent. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of fullness, the silence that follows something that has used all the air in a room, that has pressed itself into every corner and settled into the bones of every person present and now rests, complete. No one moved, no one spoke. The baby against its mother's chest slept on. Brennan Cole was still facing the wall. His shoulders, when he finally turned, were different, something in them had gone. The squareness was still there, the good coat, the lanyard, but the certainty had quietly left, and what remained was younger and less finished. The face of a man who has just understood something about himself that is uncomfortable and necessary. His eyes were red. He made no attempt to explain this. He looked at Walter's back, the old man still seated at the piano, head slightly bowed, hands in his lap, and opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. He began. He stopped. There was nothing adequate. He was intelligent enough to know this, and in this moment honest enough to admit it. Whatever he said would be too small. An apology would be too small. An explanation would be too small. Everything he had available to him in that moment was too small for what had just happened and what he had said before it. And so he said nothing. And the nothing was more honest than anything else he could have offered. Priya was sitting on the steps of the stage. She did not remember sitting down. At some point in the last 31 minutes she had folded herself onto the steps and drawn her knees up and simply listened. And now she sat with her tablet face down beside her and her eyes wet and her whole careful professional composure. The composure she had spent her 20s constructing, simply gone. She looked at Walter's hands resting in his lap. She thought about everything those hands had done and not done, everything they had chosen and not chosen, everything they had carried. "Who are you?" she said. She had not meant to say it aloud. Walter heard it. He did not turn immediately. He sat for another moment in the silence, with his hands in his lap and Schubert still resonating somewhere inside him, and then he turned slowly on the bench to face the room. He looked at them all, at Priya on the steps, and Brennan at the wall, and the colleague on the floor, and Arthur at the back with his ring of keys, and the young mother and the delivery boy, and Margaret in her good coat in the doorway, still with both hands pressed to her chest. He looked at all of them with the calm, unhurried gaze of a man who has been somewhere very deep and has returned, and is in no particular rush to return to the surface world and its categories. Then, very quietly, with the ghost of something that was almost a smile at the corner of his mouth, not triumphant, not bitter, simply warm, simply human, he said, "I'm nobody in particular." He reached down and picked up his canvas bag from beside the bench. He settled the strap over his shoulder. He placed his hand, one last time, flat against the top of the Bersendorfer, not a gesture of farewell exactly, but of gratitude, and then he rose from the bench. Margaret stepped aside from the doorway. He walked toward it slowly with that careful knee, with that same unhurried dignity with which he had done everything, and as he passed her she reached out and touched his arm. He stopped. She looked at him. Her eyes were still wet, and she made no pretense otherwise. She was 73 years old and had lived long enough to know that some moments require nothing more than witness. "Schubert's last sonata," she said softly. "His very last." Walter looked at her. Something passed between them, the particular recognition of two people who have loved the same thing for a long time. "He knew," Walter said simply. "At the end, he knew." Margaret nodded. Her hand tightened briefly on his arm and then released. Walter Haynes walked out of the Aldrich building and into the gray November morning, his canvas bag over his shoulder, his breath making small, quiet clouds in the cold air. Behind him no one spoke for a very long time, and in the silence of that abandoned hall, that gutted, condemned, supposedly worthless hall, something remained. Not sound exactly, not any more, but the memory of sound. The shape of it, pressed into the air and the walls and the people who had been present, the way music presses itself into everything it touches and does not entirely leave. It would not leave this room. It would not leave any of them. The street received him without ceremony. This was as it should be. Walter had never required ceremony from the world, and the world, for its part, had long since stopped offering it. The November morning continued as November mornings do, indifferent, gray, faintly damp, the city moving around him in its perpetual rush toward the next necessary thing. He walked slowly, as he always walked. His knee complained on the first curb, and he paused, steadied himself, and continued. The canvas bag shifted on his shoulder. He adjusted it with the practiced ease of a man who has carried what he has and made no protest about the weight. He did not look back at the Aldrich building, not because he felt nothing for it, but because Walter Haynes had learned, over the long, patient course of his 71 years, that looking back at beautiful things too long has a cost. That beauty, revisited too urgently, can become a kind of grief. And he had carried enough grief. He had carried it well and faithfully and without complaint. But he was tired, in the way that only the very old and the very honest are tired, not of living, but of the particular heaviness that living accumulates when it is carried alone. He turned north on 4th Street, toward the park on Calloway, where there were benches that caught the morning sun when the sun chose to appear, and where a man could sit without being moved along, and where the pigeons were old enough and wise enough to ask nothing of the people around them. He had been walking for perhaps 4 minutes when he heard footsteps behind him, quick ones, the footsteps of someone younger catching up. He did not slow down, he did not speed up. He continued at his own pace, the pace of a man who goes where he is going at the speed that is honest to him, and lets the world arrange itself accordingly. "Sir." It was Priya. "Sir." It was Priya. She had her coat buttoned now, her tablet tucked under one arm. She had been crying recently enough that the evidence remained, faint but visible, at the corners of her eyes. She did not seem embarrassed by this. She fell into step beside him, adjusting her pace to his, which was a courtesy Walter noticed and did not comment on. They walked together for a moment in silence. "I don't know your name," she said. "Walter," he said. She nodded as though this confirmed something she had half known. I'm Priya. I know, he said. It's on your lanyard. She looked down at the lanyard, and something moved across her face. A small, complicated smile. The kind that arrives when you realize you have been slightly foolish in a way that is also entirely human. She unclipped the lanyard and put it in her coat pocket. They walked a little further. How long? She asked. She did not specify, she did not need to. Walter considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The piano. 53 years of serious study. Before that, another 8 of lessons. So, 61 years altogether. Priya was quiet for a moment. And you've been, she paused, chose her words carefully with a care he appreciated. Out here. How long? 14 months, he said. Simply, without apology, without the faint performance of hardship that people sometimes adopt when speaking of difficulty, as though suffering requires an audience to be legitimate. Where do you go? She asked at night. The shelter on Morrison Street mostly, when there's room. He glanced at her briefly. Your colleague mentioned it. He wasn't wrong about where it was. She closed her eyes for half a step. I'm sorry, she said. For what he said, for all of it. Walter was quiet for a moment. They had reached the corner of 4th and Calloway, and the park was visible ahead, its bare November trees standing in a row along the iron fence, patient and untroubled. He didn't know, Walter said. That doesn't make it. No, Walter agreed. It doesn't make it right, but it does make it human. We decide what people are worth very quickly and very confidently, and we are wrong more often than we know. I have done it myself. He paused. I was wrong about the piano this morning. I decided it would be too far gone, too out of tune, too neglected to be worth playing. He glanced at her again, and there was something in his expression, dry, gentle, wise, that made her understand he was not only talking about the piano. Was it? She asked. Too far gone. Nothing that has been built well, Walter said carefully, is ever entirely too far gone. It may need attention. It may need someone willing to sit with it and listen past the imperfections and find what is still true in it. They stopped at the entrance to the park. Priya stood facing him, and Walter stood as he always stood, unhurried, upright, his canvas bag on his shoulder and his worn coat buttoned against the cold in his eyes, behind their 71 years of weather, clear and steady and entirely present. She reached into her coat pocket, not the lanyard pocket, the other one, and produced a card. Small, white, simple. She held it out to him. He looked at it without taking it immediately. The Aldrich building, she said, isn't going to be luxury apartments. He looked up at her. I'm going to make sure of that, she said. The certainty in her voice was not the brisk, proprietary certainty of the woman who had walked into the building an hour ago with a tablet and a lanyard and a development brief. It was quieter than that and considerably more serious. I can't promise what it becomes instead. That will take time, and there are people above me who have opinions, but I can promise I will try. Walter looked at her for a long moment. That hall deserves music, he said, not as a request, as a statement of fact offered gently. Yes, said Priya, it does. He took the card. He looked at it once and then placed it in the breast pocket of his coat, against his chest, near where the photograph of a leaner lived in its folded paper square. There is a program, Priya said carefully. She had looked this up on her phone as she walked, in the 4 minutes between leaving the building and catching him on the street, at the Meridian Community Center, 2 blocks from here. For seniors who need housing assistance. They have a caseworker named Helen Torres. She is, I've read good things about her. Walter nodded once. I'm not telling you what to do, Priya added quickly. I'm only. You're being kind, Walter said. There's no need to apologize for that. She looked at him, and her composure, which she had been carefully reassembling during the walk, slipped again, just slightly at the edges. You should be playing, she said. The words came out with more feeling than she had intended, and she did not try to walk them back. Not just in abandoned buildings, somewhere people can hear you, properly. Walter considered this. He thought of the conservatory in Boston and Professor Aldous Marsh, who had said something similar, not in those words, but with that same quality of conviction, that certainty that a gift of a certain magnitude carries with it an obligation to the world. He had believed it then. He was not entirely sure what he believed now. "People heard me this morning," he said. Priya opened her mouth and closed it again. She could not argue with this. "That was enough," Walter said. And then with that ghost of a smile again, warm, private, unhurried. For today that was enough. He touched the brim of an imaginary hat. An old gesture, unconscious. The gesture of a man formed in an era of different courtesies, and turned toward the park. Priya stood on the pavement and watched him go. He walked the way he always walked, slowly, carefully, with that troublesome knee and the canvas bag and the charcoal coat, moving through the gray November morning with the quiet, undemonstrative dignity of someone who has decided, long ago and without drama, what kind of person they intend to be, and has simply been that person ever since, regardless of what the world has offered or withheld in return. He found his bench near the iron fence, where the bare trees stood their patient row. He sat down. He set the canvas bag beside him. He reached into it and found the folded photograph and held it in both hands, those curved, arthritic, extraordinary hands, without unfolding it. He did not need to unfold it. He knew every detail of it without looking. Alina at 32, the ocean behind her, her hair loose in the wind, laughing at something off camera with the whole of herself, the way she had always laughed. He held the photograph and looked out at the park, at the bare trees and the gray sky and the pigeons conducting their unhurried investigations of the path, and he breathed, in and out, slowly, the way Schubert had written his final sonata, not rushing toward the ending, not fleeing from it, but moving through it with the full, clear-eyed acceptance of a man who understands that the time given is exactly the time there is, and that what matters is not its length but what is placed inside it. Walter Haynes had placed love inside it, and music, and 31 years of teaching children in a sunny front room, and a marriage of 43 years to a woman who had looked at him as though she could not quite believe he was real, and one son, 38 years in the world, gone on a Tuesday in March, still present in some way that Walter had stopped trying to explain and simply allowed. He had placed all of this inside the time given. And this morning, for 31 minutes in an abandoned hall on a broken piano, with no audience he had sought and nothing he had needed to prove, he had played it. All of it. Offered it to the dusty air and the angled light, and the small gathering of strangers who had drifted in from the street and stood in silence and been changed by it, each in their own private way, each carrying something different home. Back at the Aldrich building, Brennan Cole stood alone on the empty stage. His colleagues had gone. Priya had gone. Arthur Fleming had gone, leaving the building unlocked in a way that was not precisely authorized but felt, somehow, correct. Brennan stood at the Bursendorfer and looked at it for a long time. Then he reached out, the way Walter had reached out, and placed one finger on a single key. Middle C, he pressed it. The note rang out, full, resonant, alive, and filled the empty hall and faded slowly, and was gone. He stood with his hand on the key and his head bowed, and said nothing to no one, in the particular silence of a man who has understood something about himself that will take a long time to fully reckon with, and has decided, quietly, to begin the reckoning. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Meridian Community Center, addressed to a caseworker named Helen Torres. It was from the offices of a development company. It concerned the future of the Aldrich building on the corner of Meridian and 4th. It proposed, subject to review and community consultation, the restoration of the ground floor concert hall, to be offered at no charge to community arts organizations, senior programs, and local musicians who needed a space in which to play and be heard. The letter was signed by Brennan Cole, Director of Acquisitions. In the margin, in small handwriting that did not match the formal font of the letter's body, someone had added 4 words. For the man there. Helen Torres read the letter twice. Then she walked down the hall to a small sitting room where several of the center's residents spent their mornings, and she looked around the room until she found who she was looking for. He was sitting near the window, in the good chair that caught the morning light. He had a paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea open in his lap, though he was not reading it. He was looking out the window at the street, at the ordinary gray morning, with the calm and unhurried attention of a man for whom the ordinary world has become, again, enough. His canvas bag sat at his feet. His hands, those curved, arthritic, extraordinary hands, rested open in his lap, palms upward, the way hands rest when they are no longer carrying anything, and are simply, quietly at peace. Helen Torres stood in the doorway and did not disturb him for a moment. She simply looked, the way Priya had looked, the way Margaret had looked, the way all of them had looked once they had understood what they were seeing, with the particular attention we give, too rarely and too late, to those who have been among us all along, quiet and unremarkable and full, so impossibly full of everything. Then she said gently, "Mr. Haynes." Walter turned from the window. He looked at her, at the letter in her hand, at the expression on her face. He did not ask what it contained. He seemed, somehow, already at peace with whatever it was, with all of it. The morning and the music and the letter and the bench in the park and the photograph in his breast pocket and the whole long, faithful, uncelebrated, extraordinary life that had brought him to this chair in this light, on this quiet morning. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that the world, when it finally turns toward you, will find you exactly as you are, and that this, exactly as you are, is enough. It has always been enough. The ones who are hardest to see are often the ones carrying the most light. The end. Thank you for watching Oron Tales. If Walter's story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you once set aside, or a talent the world never thought to ask about, please share this story. Someone out there needs to hear it today. Like, share. And remember, dignity is not something the world gives you. It is something you carry quietly, faithfully, all on your own. All on your own.